Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So, guys, tonight or today, this morning, I should say on Friday, I have an amazing guest, Professor Richard Wolff, foremost Marxian economist. Mr. Wolff, Professor Wolff, please tell the audience hello.
Hello, audience, and I'm glad to be here.
So, I've had several questions. I've met you once, and let's start here. Let's start at the first point. How do you become America's foremost Marxian economist? Let's start at the beginning before we jump into the middle of stuff.
Well, it turns out to be quite easy. For most of the last 50 years here in America, not so much in other parts of the world, but here in America, anything having to do with Marxism, socialism, communism was frowned upon, was persecuted, was hounded out of jobs if they had one, kept out of jobs if they didn't have it yet. So it was kind of easy joining a club that nobody else wanted to be in. And I wouldn't have joined it either, except that I kept looking around me at what was going on here in the United States, and I concluded that the economic system we have wasn't working for most people. And once you get that idea in your head, for example, by looking at the poverty that's all around us, by looking at the inequality, a tiny number of people with ridiculous amounts of money they can't figure out how to spend, and then millions of people who can't give their family the food they need, who can't pay for the college education their children have to make it in this society, et cetera, et cetera. It became clear to me that this is not an economic system that works for most people. If you have that idea and you start looking around for who else thinks like you do, you pretty quickly discover that there's a tradition that's over 150 years old of people called Marxists, because they take their inspiration from the first great critic of capitalism, Karl Marx. By the way, it happens to be the 200th anniversary of his birth. He was born literally in the month of May in the year 1818, so it's exactly 200 years ago. And when you discover that tradition and you start reading not just the works by Marx, but the other works that were inspired by Marx, you discover that there's a whole rich analysis all over the world, in every country, of people who have been critical of capitalism and basically think that we can do better as an economic system than capitalism. And that just like the human race once was mired in slavery and put that behind us, and then was mired in feudalism and put that behind us, that we have every reason to believe that capitalism, like every other system the human race has ever had, was born, evolved over time, and eventually passed away for another better system. And I'm glad we don't have slavery anymore, and I'm glad we don't have feudalism, but I think capitalism, it's time to go. You've had your 300 years, you've had your chance to prove yourself, and yet I live in a country where Jeffrey Bezos, the head of Amazon, has $130 billion, and I'm surrounded here in New York City where I live with literally millions of people who don't know what economic condition they'll have 2 months from now and whether they'll be able to stay in their apartment. I don't think I need a PhD in economics, although I have one. I don't think I need one to understand that there's something fundamentally wrong with a system that works this way.
Yeah, that's obscene. I mean, Jeff Bezos walking around with $100 billion is obscene. I mean, one of the reports came out about California, about the homelessness population in California, like exploded. And yet, Jeff Bezos is walking around with $100 billion. And people look at this and say, that's fair.
Yeah,
like that's fair. That works.
Let me give you an example, because I'm an economics professor. If you have it's $130 billion, Mr. Bezos. The way that works in American capitalism is he gives that money to something called a hedge fund. And the job of the hedge fund, and there are lots of them in America, is to take the money of a rich guy like Bezos and invest it for him, manage it for him. Okay, they promise Mr. Bezos, the hedge funds, to make at least 5 or 6% a year for him, maybe a good bit more. And so he can be in charge of Amazon and spend his time doing that and spending his money and having a nice time and sending rocket ships to Mars, which he likes to do. And other people will manage his money. Well, I did a little arithmetic. If you take $130 billion and you give it to a hedge fund, let's assume the hedge fund doesn't do all that well for you, does only around 4% a year. I mean, most of them can do well better than that, but let's assume 4% a year. Well, that works out to $5 billion with a B, $5 billion a year. So I took my little pencil, the way we economists do, and I figured out how much that would be per week for Mr. Bezos. And the answer is, now hold on to your hat, $100 million every week.
Wow.
I try to explain to people, that means that Mr. Bezos wins the lottery every week, 52 weeks of the year. You and I buy lottery tickets and win nothing. He doesn't buy a lottery ticket and he wins it every week. This is a crazy country.
It is.
Whatever Mr. Bezos did, let's give him the benefit of the doubt that he invented a new way to distribute goods and services, that he organized it very well. Let's give him that. And let's give him some reward for helping to develop a new and better system. I'm okay with all of that. But there is no reason, no need, and no justification for having one man able to do what he wants with $130 billion while millions of people do without the basic necessities of a decent life. I don't think any religion I know of, any ethics I know of, can morally justify an economic system like capitalism that works that way.
And yet people accept it. Like, and not just accept it, they internalize it and say, this is the way the world is. This is the way the world should be. This is right. This is just natural, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they go about their affairs. You know, back in England, this blew me away when I found this out, because I often look at other countries and other things that happen in history in order to give you some context onto now. There was a king. There was a war with the king in England. There was a war between Parliament of England versus the king. And Parliament wins. And even after Parliament beats the king, Parliament still says, well, you need a king. They're appointed by God. And I look at that and look at the capitalistic system where people say, well, you know, they have a much larger belief that the world will come to an end as opposed to capitalism coming to an end, saying that this is the way things are supposed to be. I look at somebody having $100 billion and someone living on the street as a failure of the economic system.
Yes, I find it that way too. I love your example because, you know, England, they kept the king.
They kept him.
But just across the English Channel, there's France.
Yes.
They didn't keep their king. They cut the king's head off. With that guillotine. You remember that thing that comes down and disconnects your head from the rest of your body?
Liberty. Liberty.
So that gives us a test. Does the world fall apart if you get rid of the king?
No, it doesn't.
And France shows us the answer. Nope, no problem. Turns out human beings can govern themselves without a king. So I ask you a question. Why can't we govern ourselves in the workplace, in the office, in the store, in the factory? We don't need a king inside there any more than we need a king outside.
Right there. And that's what I wanted to go to. So you're even worker co-ops is a way of essentially trying to change the system. It's a simple, straightforward way of changing the system. Can you explain worker co-ops? Because I want to step into this in the time that we have left, because I find this to be amazing. And I think there's a point to this that I kind of really want to get to that I think you're somewhat hiding in the worker co-op thing that I think is fantastic and amazing. But please explain what worker co-ops are to people who may not necessarily know what they are.
Okay.
And why do you believe that this is the way of dealing with the way we have our system arranged now?
Good. Let me try to do that. First of all, what is a worker co-op? It's the insistence that the so-called democracy that we claim as a country to be our goal, our value system, what we believe in, that if we are going to be true to a commitment to democracy, it ought to apply to the place we work at. So let me give you a very complete, simple example. In the workplace, we now allow all the decisions to be made by a tiny group of people. The board of directors in a corporation, the major shareholders who own the bulk of the shares. That's a tiny minority of the people involved in every corporation. The majority of the people are workers. Yeah. The majority of the people are employees. My understanding of democracy says that the majority rules. Well, that would mean in a corporation that all of the people have an equal say in the decisions. So, for example, you can't have a few people at the top decide they can make more money by moving to China and depriving everybody in the business of a job. Wow, that's a very powerful decision. Why do we allow that to be made by a group of people at the top who can impact everybody else's life but are not accountable? We don't allow that in the rest of our society. We don't let the mayor or the governor or the senator do things without having any power over them. We vote them in and out of office. We can recall them. We have some power over the people who affect us. But when we go to work, we give up that power in America. Capitalism refuses to allow democracy into the workplace. And that is its fundamental flaw and its fundamental injustice. So what we advocate is let's bring democracy to the workplace. Let's have the workplace organized like a community in which everybody has an equal voice in deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that all of us help to produce who work in this factory or store or office. I think that would solve many of the problems in our society. Let me give you just two quick examples. One, suppose that all the workers democratically decided in an enterprise what was going to happen there. Do you think they give a few people like Jeff Bezos hundreds of millions and billions of dollars while everybody else couldn't put their kids through college? It would never happen. They wouldn't give everybody the same. They recognize some people work harder, some people work longer hours, some people went to school for a long time, and they would adjust it. People are reasonable. But what they wouldn't do is the unreasonable thing of giving somebody billions while everybody else hasn't got enough. That they're not going to do. You never see that happening in a community where people make decisions democratically. So I think it's the best way to reduce the inequality that everybody talks about but never seems to get solved. Well, if you democratize the enterprise, you take a major step in solving that problem. Second example, very quick. How many workers do you think would vote to close the business here and move it to China or someplace else because it's more profitable? The only reason that happens is the profits go to the folks at the top who make the decisions, and we all live with the disastrous results. We wouldn't have had the exodus of jobs in this country. We wouldn't have had the consequences that we've suffered as a nation. We wouldn't need a demagogue like Mr. Trump if we had handled this situation differently. So it seems to me there are powerful arguments that we ought to have a worker cooperative-based economy, and at the very least, we ought to have a major part of the United States convert to that so the rest of the American people can see the difference between working in a top-down, undemocratic job, which is what we all have now, versus an alternative being part of a democratically run enterprise. My guess is you give Americans the choice, I know very well where most of them will go.
I love this because this is essentially workers only the means of production. I mean, at its core, you're saying workers should only mean as production. There have been very few people who've been instrumental in shaping my worldview, and you've been one of them. You, Jack Fresco, King, James Baldwin. There's been a few people, but this idea, when you came out with it, I love the idea, and I said, Professor Wolff is being somewhat slightly sneaky here. And what I mean by this is, I've always said, if you want to really get rid of capitalism or change the system, you can't do it in one big swoop. You can't say, okay, I'm just going to chop the head of capitalism and start running around the country. I'm going to take down capitalism. You start with an idea that's somewhat insidious, that works, that's a policy, that's an awesome policy idea that deals with certain problems, that kind of chops it away a little bit at a time. And this is one of those ideas. When you had a conversation with Varney on Fox News, Varney was like, you're trying to take my money away. And you're like, no, this is just a democratic decision that we're trying to make for, for the betterment of people. What Varney was saying, Varney being a plutocrat, is looking at this as like, wait a minute, you're trying to get rid of the elites in our society. And the answer is yes, we're trying to get rid of the elites in our society. This idea of saying we want workers themselves, because if you have one company and that company is owned by the workers, no worker in their right mind is going to give somebody $100 million to run that company. No worker in their right mind is going to give somebody else $20 million. You're going to partition it in a particular way. And like you said, you have this extra bonus of not sitting those jobs overseas. But if you have one worker co-op after the next, after the next, after the next, each worker co-op is one less company owned by one guy or being directed by one guy or one small board. And it's one more company that has distributed pay more evenly, distributed pay more equitably, as opposed to having these large shares of inequalities in the society itself. You start to eat away at the inequality in the society itself. It goes beyond just the economics decision. It's somewhat of a political strategy. Is that fair?
Absolutely, 100%. That's exactly what we want. We want to do that kind of a transition. Let me give you an example of a politician, just so your viewers, your listeners can see that this is not just some pie in the sky idea. First of all, there are worker co-ops all over the world, including in the United States, who have done this and have survived and grown. Let me give you the most successful example to start with. The Mondragon Corporation. It's in Spain. Started in 1956 by a Roman Catholic priest in Spain who gave a famous speech to his workers, if we wait for capitalists to come in here and give us jobs, we'll all die of old age before that happens. And so, everybody giggled, everybody laughed, and he said, look, the way we're going to get jobs now is if we become our own employers. In other words, we set up a worker co-op where we own and operate and run the system ourselves. So under the protection of the Roman Catholic Church in 1956, Father Arizmendi, that was his name, together with 6 Spanish workers, sets up the Mondragon Corporation. Today, in May of 2018, Mondragon has become the 7th largest corporation in Spain. It includes over 100,000 workers. Wow. It is a family of 250 worker co-ops working together. They have proven that they can outcompete capitalistically organized enterprises because they've beaten them at every turn. They have proved that they can grow. They have proved that you can have worker co-ops as a large company just as well as you can have it as a small company. There are 2 American corporations so taken with how Mondragon is exploding as a successful alternative way of doing business that they pay Mondragon to allow their scientists to work alongside Mondragon scientists in their labs. Your listeners and your viewers might be interested in the names of those two American corporations, General Motors and Microsoft.
Wow.
They understand the power, even if the mass of workers in America don't yet know the power. Here's the second example. In Great Britain, they have two political parties that are large. Instead of calling them Republican and Democrat, in England, they're called Conservative and Labour Party. The Conservatives are in the government now. The Labour Party is the opposition. The leader of the Labour Party, a man named Jeremy Corbyn, is now, according to the polls, the likely next prime minister of Great Britain.
Yes.
And now hear what his policy is. His policy is when he becomes prime minister, the first law he's going to pass is the following law. Any business in England now can continue in the way that it's currently organized, that is, in a capitalist way. However, if and when that company says it's going to shut down, or if and when that company says it's going to sell itself to another company, or if and when that company is going to move out of the country somewhere else, or if and when that company is going to become a public company with shares sold on the stock market, etc., before it can do any of those things, the law will require it to offer what's called the right of first refusal to its own workers to buy the company and convert it into a worker co-op.
Yes.
And when a skeptical press asks Mr. Corbyn, well, how are the workers ever going to get the money to buy the company from the people who own it now? Mr. Corbyn smiles, looks right into the camera and says, we, the government, will lend it to the workers at a very low interest rate because we're committed to creating a worker co-op based segment of our British economy so that the British people for the first time will have the freedom to choose which way they want their economy to go. Democratic worker co-op or capitalist hierarchical top-down firm. That's a freedom of choice they're going to give the British people. That's a freedom of choice we don't have in the United States. And we make a big deal about freedom of choice. Yeah, we can go into a supermarket and choose among 27 kinds of breakfast cereal. But that doesn't matter, does it? Compared to being able to choose whether you want to work in a democratic enterprise or not, whether you want to buy goods and services from people who are a community producing it rather than a tiny group of people enabling some to become Jeff Bezos type of super rich.
I mean, I always say you could choose your plantation. Like it's like this kind of small permutation from, slave to worker and consumer. And people think that this is a major thing. It's like you're working 50 hours a week. You're spending up all your time and, all of your energy into, for the most part, the main hours of your week doing something that most people absolutely hate. That's for a wage that is not necessarily sufficient for their life. And they say, we're free. This is freedom. This is what liberty looks like. And it's like, no, that's not what liberty looks like. That's something else.
Your reference to slavery reminds me of something. There used to be debates among slaves about their situation. Slaves, thought about that just as much as anybody else did. And you had to split the following way. Some slaves said, we should be grateful because our master gives us a reasonable amount of food. He gives us a reasonable amount of clothing. We have a bed to sleep in. And it could be a lot worse because I know some slaves whose masters don't give them food and don't give them clothing. And then there were the other people who said, wait a minute, our situation can't be limited to choosing whether we are a better off slave versus a less well off slave. The problem is slavery. We shouldn't be the property of another human being. That's like a horse or a piece of land or a piece of furniture. We're a human being. And that fight had to be fought out. I think we're in the same place with capitalism. We have some workers who want us all to accept capitalism because they're better off than they could be with some other employer in another country or in another part of the business world. But there's others of us who say, no, the problem is we shouldn't be employees in the first place. We shouldn't be excluded from the decision making that our lives depend on. That's not a freestanding, democratic, it's not a free person. That's why Marx loved to refer to modern workers as wage slaves. He wanted to remind them, you're not as different from a slave as you imagine yourself to be.
Two last questions, because I know we're getting to the time limit, but is it fair to say one of my issues is dealing with the environment? Like the capitalistic system is an overlay. There's a real world, and then there's this kind of mental framework that we kind of function in. People think it's real, but it's not really real. It's this kind of mental conception that we kind of organize ourselves around. In a capitalistic system, the person extracts a huge amount of wealth, but doesn't necessarily take into account the environmental toll. That doesn't really factor into the equation of the system itself. So if I can get T-shirts from Bangladesh for $1, and I could ship them across the sea, I don't really take into account the global impact of shipping that across the ocean. I don't take into account, the supplies that it takes to do that. I don't take any of that stuff into account. Only thing I take into account is I can get those T-shirts for $1, so I'm going to get those T-shirts for $1. That's all I care about. Your particular, the idea of the worker co-op, you have little democracies. Let's essentially what they are, little democracies. But aren't those little democracies battling other little democracies? And even in the battling the other little democracies, don't you still have this kind of pressure, this capitalistic pressure? Because let's be honest, this is still capitalism to some degree. You still have this capitalistic pressure for companies to do things in particular ways, meaning if it is cheaper for me, even as a little democracy of a company, to get these T-shirts or get these underwear from Bangladesh or China, despite the environmental impact, I'm going to do that because it is in the interest of the company to do that, even though the spoils are distributed more evenly. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it's a fair question. And I think it goes to being really clear that the transformation of an enterprise from a capitalist system to a worker co-op system doesn't solve every human problem, doesn't solve every social problem. It's a step in the right direction. It's more democracy, it is fairer to people, it is less unequal, and so on. But it still will have to face environmental realities. And I think you point to one of those. I would argue that a worker co-op will definitely be better for the environment in at least one important way. When a company faces an opportunity to profit, let's say by a new technology or a new machine that happens to have a byproduct of polluting the water or polluting the area where the factory is or dumping crap into the air that we all breathe. We now have a system where a tiny group of people, board of directors, major owners, who often live thousands of miles away in New York or Chicago or LA, making the decision and deciding, well, it's more profitable to have that machine, so we're going to do it, and if workers don't like it, they can go somewhere else. Well, if you're the workers making the decision about that machine, you know that you're going to be breathing that bad air. Right. And so is your husband and your wife and your children and your neighbors and your community. You're going to be way slower in bringing into reality dangerous, ecologically destructive equipment and technology than capitalists were. That doesn't mean all the problems of environment will be solved. The one you point to will still be something that concerned people are going to have to agitate about. Let's pay $3 for the T-shirt and not pollute the ocean rather than that. Those questions will still stand. But I think you'll see that worker co-ops will already make a major improvement on the ecological questions because they have to live with those consequences. We won't anymore have the situation where the workers and their community live with the consequences, but the decision about technology and pollution is made by a tiny group of people who only worry about the profit or the so-called bottom line.
No, that I agree with you. So if I am breathing this water, I am more concerned about the social impact of what I'm doing as opposed to
That's
if I'm not, not breathing the water. If I'm drinking this water, if I'm breathing this air, I am much more concerned about, hey, am I putting this into the environment for my kids to inhale, as opposed to sitting in California and not necessarily caring about the environmental impacts of something taking place in New York. No, I agree with you. That I absolutely agree with you
a
on.
real step forward. But I don't want to promise people something that will look like it's pie in the sky.
Yeah.
When you got rid of slavery, people imagined everybody would then be happy and free and equal. Where we had to learn it's right to get rid of slavery. It was a horrible institution, but it was only a step toward what we need and want. It didn't bring it all at once. Going beyond capitalism is the same thing. It's a major improvement. We can do better, but it isn't the end of human history. It isn't the solution to all our problems. And I don't want to have the idea of worker co-ops be out there claiming for itself magical properties. It's not that.
No, I agree with you. I love the idea because I don't necessarily think you ever get to. I don't think utopia exists, and I don't think you in one fell swoop you snap your fingers and oh my God, we're here in utopia. I think you make small moves in order to get to that place, and I think the worker co-op is an amazing small step. Not small, but it's a big step from the standpoint of pay, from getting jobs shipped overseas, from people having access, or more agency in the job that they're working. I mean, there's major steps in regards to how we organize ourselves. I love it.
Right. And one more thing, security. Here in the United States, we have converted at least what for many people, and unfortunately, many of them being white people rather than people of color, they had, up until recently, reasonably secure jobs. Now, the majority of white workers are having to discover what was the reality for non-white workers for a long time, that they don't know from 1 year to the next. They may not even know from 1 week to the next how many hours of work they'll have, what kind of income they'll have. How do you have a life like that? One of the things human beings need is some basic security so they can plan, so they can make relationships with other people that don't get strained out of existence by the reality of their job and their income. We owe that to ourselves, to give ourselves as a community the security that a decent life needs. Capitalism has now taken that away from almost everyone, and that too is something that a worker co-op would give priority to, that security that people need and are desperate for, but that this system denies.
Let me get one last question in because we're pushing it up against the time frame. How does it all end? So we ended up with Trump. Before Trump, Obama ran on hope and change, and he had this euphoric emancipatory humanism of hope. We're gonna have hope. God damn it, I'm the embodiment of hope, and we're gonna change the stuff. And he gets in office, and I remember the first few months, people are like, "All right, we'll give him time." And then the first year, the lefties were looking at this like, okay, once he beats Romney, man, he's gonna rip the chains off. He's gonna be coming out bare chested. He's gonna be amazing, and slowly this kind of dim realization of, oh, we've been had.
Yep.
It wasn't hope and change at all. And the sad part about this is using this message of hope and change as this kind of the rally cry, knowing full well that this is just a publicity stunt of sorts. This is like Pepsi and Coke giving an advertisement saying that this is joy in a bottle when it's just sugar and syrup. And you give the public that message because the public wants that message. They want the change. So you end up with Sanders and you end up with Trump, and they shaft Sanders, and Clinton, status quo completely. There's no even doubt, status quo, running against Donald Trump, and the public chooses reality shows, flailing, looking for something different. They say this man is a maniac, but he's something different. We want something different. How does this all end? Because this is it's somewhat of amazing development. The guy's a reality show host. There's no experience whatsoever. He's only ever looked out for himself his entirety of his life. If the public is willing to go this far to get some level of change, this looks like a system that is trying to fall apart. How does this all potentially end? And let me add one more part to this. I often kind of make this point that the capitalistic system is not real. Like all this stuff, none of this stuff is absolutely real. It's mental figments. It can change. The problem is, how do people get it to change when people don't necessarily think that it can change? The system itself doesn't make it account. If I'm we have automation. I'm sorry, machinery essentially taking over in the sense of AIs. And at some point, the mechanisms, machinery is going to get to the point of saying, okay, we're going to eliminate more and more jobs. Uber and Google were in a lawsuit about automated cars. In California right now, they've legalized automated cars. Those auto plants, people who own those car places are going to get rid of those jobs the moment that it becomes feasible to put in a robot to do that job. Same thing with 7-Eleven. Amazon is going to take over many of these stores, not 7-Eleven stores, but they're going to start putting automation in. So a person walks in, walks out, it automatically debits their card. This is going to take place all over the United States because the incentive is for it to take place in the United States. They can make more of a buck doing this as opposed to paying a worker, in which case that's what they're going to do. So the system itself has all the means necessary, meaning the technological means to make sure everyone has the things that they need. But they don't use technology for that, meaning the society itself is ill prepared to deal with the realities of what's coming up in our society. And yet it has means to deal with those things. It just doesn't. How on earth does this fall apart? And how on earth do we get to some level of change without it falling apart first? And do you believe it will change before it falls apart? That's a lot, but I'm trying to pile over there at the last.
Well, I think what you're saying is 100% spot on. I only wish more people who interviewed me would ask this question, because it's the right one to ask. One of the this goes back to the very beginning of our conversation. One of the things that drew me to Marxism was Marx's idea that capitalism is an inherently contradictory system, that parts of it are directly in contradiction with other parts of it, and that the whole system will only survive so long as it can manage those contradictions, or otherwise it will blow itself up. I think you're right. I share your view. This is an economic system that is falling apart. It can provide huge profits, but for a tiny group of people at the expense of the mass of people. It makes, therefore, the mass of people angry and bitter and despairing. And of course, in that moment, they will go for anything different, like a Trump, because they hope maybe, since the normal Republican and Democrats like Clinton or Bush or, sadly, Obama too, just keep the basic system going. They don't resolve it, so they go for a Trump. I'm sure, watching Mr. Trump, they will pretty soon understand that he's just the same old Republican right-wing rah-rah capitalism that we've always had. You know, his veneer will disappear and we'll see what he is. So I don't think this system is going to be able to resolve its problems. I don't think it will be able to give people a proper job at a decent income, which it is the task of any decent economic system to do. And as it fails, it will make Americans, like it has done elsewhere, turn against it. That's why I'm able to run around the country. That's why I have my own radio and television program, because somehow people listen and they recognize something about their own lives and they're interested. So here's my fear and my hope, all wrapped together. Capitalism, I'm going to overstate it, but it really is what I think. Capitalism is dying. Like all systems, it's had its shot. It's been around for 300 years. It's become the global system. It can't solve the problems any economic system has to. So it's going to go. And that's always painful. And there are two ways for us to proceed. One way is to say, let's try this other way. And that's why I advocate worker co-ops. It's a different system. But I know, I'm not stupid, and I've read my history. I know that people upset to be caught in a dying system can easily be given the idea there's some bad folks out there who are causing the trouble. We call that scapegoating, and that's a very old human attraction. So look at us here in America. That's Mr. Trump's job, to identify scapegoats, to focus the anger of the American people anywhere but the dying economic capitalism. So we're told to be angry at the immigrants. We're told to be angry at the Chinese for producing goods more cheaply and more effectively than we can. We're told to be angry at every foreigner. And pretty soon we're going to be told to be angry at people who aren't white, at people who aren't male, at people who don't have a college education. You're going to see every scapegoat operation imaginable, because the system wants to blame everybody but itself. And that's going to be the war between those of us who understand the system is dying, let's go to one that has a chance to live, versus those that want to consume us in a war with North Korea, or a war with Iran, or a wall in front of Mexico. You can see all of the political theater of a Trump as the desperate efforts of a dying system to hold on.
Last, and I always ask this for everybody: is there anything that you want to put out before we end the interview? Like, is there anything that you want to say? Is there anything you want to espouse? Is there anything that I asked that you want to talk about that you haven't had the opportunity to say? And just one last point: that it's funny, China has essentially just modeled itself as a capitalistic society. I mean, they may call themselves communists, whatever else. We're mad at them because they're doing capitalism better than we are. It's like, those bastards, they've taken on our capitalistic tricks and they're doing it better than we are. We need to do something about China, so we need to give up our sovereignty with the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TTIP in order to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Jamari, you know a lot of this stuff. I'm very impressed. I'm a professor, and I wish I had you in my class.
Thank you.
You're the kind of student that takes the job of the teacher and does it alongside the other students. But in any case, let me just add to your point about China. I'm an economist, so I watch trends. Over the last 10 years, the average wage in America has been stagnant. That is, if you adjust the amount of money an average American worker gets for the prices he or she has to pay, what they can actually buy with their weekly wage is the same now as it was 10 years ago. In China, the average real wage over the last 10 years has tripled.
Wow.
So try to understand, while this information is kept from the American people, I mean, you could find it, but you have to know how to look for it. The newspapers do not want to talk about it, neither does the television, but you go check me out, you will confirm it. Capitalism of the sort they have in China, and that's really what they do have, has been able to deliver to the workers a tripling of their standard of living in the last 10 years. The United States has delivered to its working population no increase at all. I mean, this is not a contest where you have the doubt about the outcome. This is a contest which one side has already won. And you can only keep that so long from the mass of people. As to the final things to say, thank you for the opportunity. I have two of them. One, if anything I have said is of interest to your audience, please make use of our websites where there's loads more of this stuff. The first one is democracyatwork.info, I-N-F-O. So if you're interested in this, go to democracyatwork, that's all one word, .info.
I put it at the bottom.
And the other website is rdwolff, WOLFF.com, rdwolff.com. Both of these websites are filled with the kinds of conversations, interviews that we've just done here. If you find this interesting, that's a way to pursue it. And the other thing, and then I have to go, is back to the first question you asked me. Much of what you're hearing from me is what I learned from Marx and the Marxist tradition. It's a repository of criticisms of capitalism and ideas of where to go next. To close yourself off from that literature is a kind of shooting yourself in the foot. It's like you're saying, I don't want to use a match to start a fire. I want to rub sticks together. Well, you know, you could get a fire like that, but it goes faster with a match. You'll get the ideas. You'll get the inspiration. You'll help us make the transition to the next system if you make use of this enormous body of creative thinking and activities by people like you and me who found their way to a critical perspective on capitalism.
Professor Wolff, thank you very much for showing up. I really appreciate this conversation. Like I said, you've been one of those people who's influenced my worldview. And I don't say that mildly because there's only a very small section of people who's influenced it in that such a way. And what I mean by that is just an analysis of what's taking place and a way of, I guess, a way of understanding how our system is set up. And even getting to the point of saying this isn't real. Like, this is really just a mental framework. And there's certain pluses and minuses. You can have whatever world you want, providing you're willing to live with the consequences. And these are the consequences of this particular world. It doesn't have to be this way. So thank you very much. I'm going to let you go.
And let me thank you, Jabari, because unless there are people like you taking the initiative to produce this kind of a program, have these kinds of conversations, that's part of what the social change is we need. So you're making just as important a contribution as I am by creating the chances for these conversations to happen. So I thank you.
Keep kicking ass.
All right.
Keep kicking ass. Have a good one. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Let's see. There was somebody who said something. Man, you have no idea how much I love this interview. Sir Bike Salat Day. I love this name. The scapegoat operation that Mr. Wolff is talking about is described in John Michael Greer as strip mining idealism. Man, that's strip mining idealism. I fucking love that. I love the way people put things sometimes. Absolutely love it. All right, so I'm not going to keep this one too long. I have something I need to do this morning, but I'm going to be back. Guys, thank you very much for showing up. And big shout out to Professor Wolff for allowing this interview. I kept it a little bit longer than what he said, but hopefully he's not going to be too pissed at that. I really appreciate him coming on to the show. And I thank you guys for coming on to the show also. You guys have a good evening. If you enjoy the content, please share, like, subscribe. And of course, you can always support the Patreon. Thanks, guys.